Let us start our morning the proper way. And first of all, welcome the president of the University of the West Indies Student Guild. He is President Makesi Peters. Makesi, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning.
It is good to have you here. Government assistance for tuition expenses will no longer offer 100% financing for tertiary education, and that begins in 2070. And this is for anyone in a household earning more than $10,000. While the household income is above $10,000, where that is the case, they would have to pay 25%. Most folks today, that's not a whole lot of money, but yet there is a hue and cry. Government will continue to pay 75%. Where the household income is above $20,000, students will have to pay 50% of the fees. You sat on that task force. I don't know, is that a secret or is that not really a secret, is it?
That's true.
Right, it is not a secret. You sat on that task force. You saw the recommendations, and some of what I heard that I will not repeat here, but I understand some of those recommendations were more draconian than the ones that were actually accepted and adopted by the cabinet. Let us talk about, is this something that you, Student Guild, you and your Student Guild members agree is a sensible cut in lieu of all that the country has to deal with and the shortfall in revenue?
Well, firstly, I must say we are very happy. We're very happy that the government decided not to implement any changes that would disenfranchise our student population within this academic year. It was the fear that if a course sharing model was to be introduced, our continuing students, our enrolled students may have had to drop out. And when I was on the task force, that was one of the solid recommendations that we put forward. We looked at the statistics, yes, we identified there were wastage in the system. I reminded the task force that at the end of the day, the mandate of GATE was to provide free education for all, and more so to ensure a knowledge-based economy. So therefore, when we mirror GATE, you look at it as an investment and not an expense. So taking that into consideration, that is why we would have said, one, let us ensure these students continue in the system. If we are to introduce that, we'll have a high dropout rate, especially from our students in the medical sciences and the engineering faculty, even low, because their contribution will be significantly higher as opposed to a social sciences degree. Now, in terms of the recommendations, some of the recommendations looked at means testing, and we felt also if we were to look at means testing, and I make this point clear, it's a process that could be a bit biased, right? And therefore, the criteria needs to be looked at carefully.
Very carefully, yes.
Very carefully. Because in our country, there's always the perception that to get anything, right? To get anything, it's almost it must have some sort of political alliances, etc. And that is the perception. So to alleviate that perception, you have to ensure that all the stakeholders involved in that process, to ensure that it's fair, to ensure that GATE remains relevant for the most vulnerable.
Let us just be fair about this. Just about anything you introduce is open for graft. It is always a question of what's the mechanism you're putting inside of there to ensure that it's equally administered. I mean, this is no different from anything. You can go from a SUSU all the way up to banking with Citibank.
Yes. and if you look at the 25% contribution, now some people are saying it is fair. Now it is fair for a family who have, let's say, one child. He's doing a social sciences degree. Now the average social sciences degree on a semesterly basis is about $6,000 at the UWI. Now 1/3 of that is, I think, about $1,500 for one semester, which is about 4 to 5 months. Now, really and truly, that's a small amount of money. Now, if you look at a parent who has a child doing medicine, a child who is doing, let's say, social sciences, and perhaps one going COSTAT, and is making a baseline salary of $10,000, now we are going to ask them to pay 25% towards their child's education at a salary of $10,000. Really and truly, that might be, medical sciences is roughly about $150,000 for the 3 terms. Engineering could range from about $80,000 to $90,000. Now the semesterly rate is significantly higher to that of a social sciences degree. So therefore, everything must be data driven when you're making solid decisions. And therefore, we felt that cutoff range, it's squeezing the middle class people.
But is it not fair to say that is a cutoff range that has some flexibility flexibility through the process of means testing?
Now, means testing applies.
In the sense that if you look at one person, you can say this is the cutoff rate, period. If you look at one household with 3 children, as you just articulated, then there has to be some consideration of that. Isn't that part of the mechanisms that will be put in there for extra consideration?
I don't think that was explicitly stated. What was explicitly stated was that people falling below the age, below the 10,000 range, they would automatically receive 100% funding, and that will be determined by means testing.
Which is almost nobody, because less than $10,000 is hard to get by on that.
So,
as you can see.
what we are saying, we understand. I understand the situation in which the government is in, and I take note that the minister said that nothing is set in concrete, nothing is set. So therefore, we could see some changes being made, and that is where the consultation takes place. That's where the dialogue takes place. So involving all the stakeholders to ensure that the process remains equitable.
I was particularly moved when I first heard your statement. This is ignorant to the fact that you sat on that task force committee. I was heartened and encouraged to see that you said, guys, let's go into the real world. The real world is nothing is going to be for free, particularly since there is such a precipitous drop in the revenue coming to the country. And there's almost nowhere else in the world that you're going to get all of this for free. And comparatively speaking here. But in a joint statement, you, along with the Guild Presidents of the Hugh Wooding Law School, the University of Southern Caribbean, reportedly expressed relief and happiness over the decision not to introduce gate fees for students already enrolled in the 2016-17 program, which you just said as the academic year. But you unanimously disagreed with the decision to stop funding for those 50 years and over. It was stated that continuing students, as we just spoke about, over the age of 50 will be guaranteed funding to complete their programs. But when you and the other presidents say it is unfair, it is wrong, they must reconsider this 50-year cut-off. Many folks are arguing at 50, we have to just decide. You've got the 50-year-olds and you've got the young folks of the country. Who is going for the long term to be able to contribute more to the country, that the country can put that investment in? If at 50 you have not yet decided where you're going to be, well, since it takes you a 3-year program, that's 53. It takes you about 5 years to establish yourself. So by the time you're ready, you have a little time to give to the country.
Yes.
Now, is it wrong for that cutoff at 50? Even though it will be difficult for some folks, let's admit that. Is that so egregious?
Now, let me bring it home. Now, I come from a single parent home, and my dad right now, he's 60 years old, right? He's way over past the 50 range, but throughout my entire life, my father would have contributed towards my education, ensuring that I achieve certain goals, objectives, and he really, really, really invested in my education. And if it wasn't for him, I don't think I would have been where I am today. Now, let's mirror that to the wider Trinidad and Tobago. A lot of parents, really and honestly sacrifice themselves for the needs of their children.
Yes, they do.
And, when it comes a time in their life, they may want to go and better themselves, perhaps, let's say somebody in the protective service, when they retire at 45, they now have to reskill and retool. And after serving for about 45 years, not 45, but let's say about over 35 years in the service, they're now coming back into the system. I think now you have to look at it from two sides. Now there's some people who are 50. Let's look at the baseline at 50, 49, 50. These people, there's some people who could afford, who really and honestly could afford it, and therefore they shouldn't be asked. They shouldn't be asked to go through means testing or etc. But there's people who are vulnerable, people who cannot afford after making so much sacrifices for their children, and I think that special consideration perhaps could be given to members in that group who are adding towards diversification areas in our country.
Have you ever heard the term that you can have two wrongs and two rights at the same time?
Exactly.
So it is not to say that there is no merit in what you said for the over 50s, but there is also merit in saying, where are we going to put this money for the best return on investment? So you've got two rights in this case.
Exactly.
It is not to minimize the 50-year-old case, but it is a case of saying, listen, I've got more return coming off this. And if in the period leading up to your 50 years, because those already in programs, they are fine. those who are already continuing students. However, but those who are now making that decision, well, you should have done it a bit earlier because the going was good then. Unfortunately, the going cannot always be good. Yes. And that could be what we're looking at. Enforcement of conditions of gate is a priority. Now, in the case of those who give back the requisite time to the country after completion, there is no problem. That is fine. They're doing what they're supposed to do. The question is, what penalties are needed in fairness to those who refuse to play by the rules? There are folks who are playing by the rules, which is given back to the country and so on, and there are many people who are not doing so. So enforcement of the conditions of your gate grant is going to be important here. What penalties is recommended that can help us let folks give back what they got?
Now, while we were on the task force, some things we look at, community development. We look at community projects in which when students leave university, and GATE would have already contributed towards their education, that these students would now go into the communities through homework centers, just giving back to these secondary schools and all the whole idea of philanthropy. Now, in terms of those who refuses to give back at all, and instead go away and contribute to a brain drain in the country, we felt on the task force, it was recommended that we put in place a BIR requirement.
When my guests say we, let me just remind you in case you just tuned in to Brunch, his name is Makesi Peters. He is the president of the University of the West Indies Student Guild. Please go ahead, yes.
Yes. So with a BIR number, Board of Inland Revenue, the government will be able to track these people. So when they start to work, when let's say if they was to go away, they could have some sort of indicator that, hey, this student is not giving back, and through Board of Inland Revenue, they could collect back the funds that was owed to the government for non-completion. And next thing you have to understand as well is that in the system, there's a high level of transferring taking place. As a student going to, let's say, a unaccredited private institution, they would now realize that, hey, I want to be something else. I was studying social work in one area. I want to study criminology now. So they want to switch over. Most times what happens is that the criteria, more so the credits that they obtain on the unaccredited institutions, when they come over, it is not really on par with the public universities, let's say UTT, UWI, etc. So therefore, the responsibility, and that is why I share two views. Yes, the government's mandate is to ensure that education remains relevant, but at the same time, as a student, you have a responsibility to ensure that we get returns. And if you are transferring to a new program and then disregarding the contribution that the government would have given, therefore that is dishonesty on your behalf, and therefore there's some people who are more deserving of that. And that is where the penalties need to be enforced even more.
My guest, as aforementioned, is Guild President of the University of the West Indies, Makesi Peters. There are many other new innovations that also the Minister mentioned that have not been paid attention to that I think is instructive and useful for folks to know when folks think in terms of this is a draconian, this is difficult, this is a rough on families. I mean, there is effective August 2070's funding for postgraduate degrees will be available to students whose programs are in alignment with the country's developmental needs. That's part of what we talked about with the number of students who are coming out become the underemployed because they get out there and there is no place for them to go.
Exactly. And if you look at, it was very interesting. At our consultation meeting at the UWI, we had a regional student contributed towards that. And she's a St. Vincentian. And she said to us, in order for her to come here, her government would have given about 10 sectors, 10 core areas, and said to them, this is where the government is willing to offer 100% funding. And most of the students at the UWI who are from the other islands are studying areas from which their country needed.
Yes.
Right? So when they go back, they are 100% sure to get a job because those are the sectors identified.
So the government's not funding something for them to go elsewhere in order to get employment and contributing to a brain drain, as it were. There's also education saving bonds, a national education saving fund. There is a hope to encourage the private sector via tax incentives to make fund contributions to children of employees. The government will also offer fiscal incentives to encourage insurance companies and credit unions to invest in educational savings.
Yes.
So again, it is a whole program that I think folks have to look at the whole thing. There are some details in this that are absent, and we have to see the details of that. But I think just reacting to the shock, what folks term the shock value, that it hits the headline all the time, 10,000, 20,000, who's eligible and so on. There are other support mechanisms that are articulated that will in fact soften this blow greatly.
And I think what was commendable and what was a recommendation that was also taken into consideration by the cabinet, put forward by our consultation meeting at UWI, is that the government should have considered to raise the 25,000 help loan up until $35,000, and that was considered. We saw that decision being taken by the cabinet. Now, one thing we called for is that if the help loan is now available for the wider citizenry, it should move from being discretionary, because the reality is some people apply for the help loan, some don't get through. And some get through, but they don't get what they ask for. And therefore, if the government plans to introduce a cost-sharing model from 2017, that loan, that cap shouldn't be discretionary. It should be mandatory to ensure that the support is there for our student population, to ensure that people who really cannot afford rent and afford food on a living basis, all these different things, it will provide as a buffer to assist them tremendously.
At the end of the day, I am encouraged at the approach taken by you and the other guild presidents, because there is a reality. And we were joking before we turned on the microphone about most countries where you hear students saying, I've got to leave class because I got a job to catch, and after that job I got another job, and then I get 4 hours and I'll be back here again. It is not to say that we are saying that what obtains there should obtain here, but there is a thing out there called reality. Countries with greater GDPs than ours, they know that this is not sustainable. This an initiative like GATE unchecked.
Yes.
Assistance, you see, and that's the important part that folks have to take out of this. Government assistance for tuition expenses. Can I repeat that? Government assistance for tuition expenses. President Makesi Peters, anything you want to leave our listeners with that you find is misunderstood in the public domain that you think is worthy, since you were on the task force, since you see the actual compromises being made in this? And we are hoping, I'm hearing that we're not going to, but I'm hoping that we actually get the full report.
Yes.
It is going to be useful to have the details we mentioned, elaborated on and disclosed by the minister, but it also would be instructive to see the recommendations of the task force if we ever see them.
What I want to say is that some people believe that while on the task force, the UWI Guild provided inadequate representation. And that is the perception. No one saw behind closed door what would have been done. We would have done all that we could have to bring forward solid recommendations towards the task force, to ensure that our student population isn't disenfranchised. And one thing people also need to understand, that as president, I sat in that capacity, in that position as president of the UWI Guild of Students, and I signed a confidentiality statement. So there were certain things that could not be discussed within the public domain. So I took a proactive approach, and I shared the terms of reference with the student population with my other guild colleagues and asked for contribution. And as I stated before, that was forwarded to the cabinet, it was forwarded to the minister, and 2 things we called for, and that is why we keep repeating that we are happy with some of these decisions, which was ensuring that our continuing students are not affected, and ensuring that enrolled students are not affected.
You got both of those.
We got those things. Also looking at the help loan, increasing it. And therefore now, all I am calling for is more consultation with that means testing to ensure the process remains fair and unbiased.
And there's a job responsibility for your organization as to the other guild presidents to make sure the right information is understood by people as against what the public domain does with information.
Exactly.
Give you third, fourth, and fifth generation of the same thing that sounds like
Exactly.
something completely different when,
Yes.
when it's all finished. All I can do is thank you, Makesi Peters, for taking the time to be with us this morning. I truly appreciate it.
No problem.
All right, we will keep working this together because at the end of the day, no one person has the answer. The entire citizenry must be involved in collectively achieving the desired position of the country. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Take